The church stood quiet that morning, its white paint faded under the harsh Texas sun. Dust swirled around the steps where guests had gathered just hours earlier, their chatter and laughter filling the air with expectation. Now only whispers remained, fragments of disbelief, shame, and pity that clung to the wind like ash. Inside, Mary Ellen sat alone on the wooden bench, still wearing her wedding dress. Her hands trembled as she held her newborn daughter close to her chest. The baby whimpered softly, her tiny face scrunched against the lace of the gown. Mary Ellen didn't cry anymore. The tears had run dry somewhere between the preacher's quiet sigh and the empty space at the altar where her groom should have stood. The town of Dry Creek had never been kind to women who strayed from its narrow path. And though Mary Ellen hadn't done anything wrong, gossip didn't care for truth. It only needed fuel, and she had given them plenty. A baby born before vows were spoken, a fiancé who vanished the morning of the wedding, and a past she couldn't defend. She had once believed love could save her from all that. Now she wasn't so sure. The doors creaked open behind her. For a moment she thought it might be him, Tom Briggs, the man she was supposed to marry. But the footsteps that entered were heavier, slower, like a man who carried silence as part of his being. When she turned, she saw him, a tall rancher in a worn duster coat, dust caked on his boots, hat shadowing most of his face. Folks in Dry Creek called him the Silent Rancher. His real name was Daniel Hayes, but hardly anyone used it. He lived miles out on the edge of the valley, alone except for a few horses and a herd of longhorns that roamed his land like ghosts. He spoke little, fought less, but everyone knew he had a quiet strength about him, the kind that didn't need proving. Mary Ellen stiffened, clutching her baby tighter. Daniel nodded once, removing his hat. The light from the high windows cut across his face, revealing eyes the color of river stone, steady and unreadable. "Miss," he said, voice low and rough from disuse. "You shouldn't be here alone." Her throat tightened. "I'm not alone," she whispered, glancing down at the sleeping baby. "Not anymore." He looked at the child for a long moment, then back at her. Outside, a gust of wind pushed the church doors wider, rattling them against the frame. The silence stretched until it felt like time itself had stopped moving. "Town's talking," Daniel said quietly. "Word travels fast here." "I know," she replied, bitterness creeping into her tone. "Let them talk. They always do." He studied her, not with pity but with something else, something she hadn't seen in days. Respect maybe. Or understanding. "You got a place to go?" he asked. Her lips trembled. "No," she admitted. "Not anymore." The words hung in the air like confession. For the first time she felt their full weight. No home, no husband, no name she could rely on. Just a baby and a town that would sooner spit than help her. She straightened her shoulders anyway, forcing her voice to steady. "But I'll manage. I always have." Daniel nodded again as if he believed her. He turned toward the door, then paused. "If you change your mind," he said, "my ranch is about 12 miles west. Hayes Ranch. It's quiet. Folks don't come out that way much." Before she could respond, he stepped outside, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Mary Ellen sat there long after he'd gone, the baby stirring against her arm. She didn't know why his offer lingered in her mind like a song she couldn't shake. Maybe because no one else had offered her anything at all. Not a kind word, not a hand, not a place to start over. By sundown she gathered what little she had. A torn satchel, a faded photograph of her parents, and a small blanket for the baby. The innkeeper had already asked her to leave, muttering something about reputation and decency. So she walked. The road out of Dry Creek stretched long and empty, cutting through fields of yellow grass that waved like a restless sea. Each step felt heavier than the last, but the baby's soft breaths kept her moving. Mary Ellen had nothing left to lose, except that tiny life in her arms. Night fell cold. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries echoing through the hills. Her feet ached, her lips cracked, and the baby whimpered in hunger. She sank to her knees beside a Dry Creek bed, exhaustion finally claiming her. She pressed the baby close, whispering, "It's all right, sweetheart. Mama's here." But her voice broke halfway through the promise. The sound of hooves came first, slow, deliberate, drawing closer through the darkness. She looked up, fear and hope wrestling inside her. A lantern swung from a saddle horn, its light spilling over the rocks and grass until it found her face. Daniel Hayes dismounted without a word. He lifted the lantern higher, studying the sight before him. The woman in a torn wedding gown, barefoot and pale, clutching her child under the endless Texas sky. "I told you it was a long way," he said quietly. She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. Guess I didn't make it. He crouched beside her, his coat brushing the dirt. You're lucky I came lookin', he said. Storm's rollin' in from the east. Would have buried you both in dust. Why did you come? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He just reached out, gently lifting the baby from her arms. His hands, rough from ranch work, cradled the child with surprising tenderness. Didn't seem right, he finally said. Leaving you to face all that alone. For the first time in days, Mary Ellen felt tears rise again, hot, unwanted but real. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. Daniel said nothing, only waited until she could breathe again. Then he helped her to her feet and guided her toward his horse. The ride to the ranch was long and silent, broken only by the soft snorts of the horse and the cry of the wind through the mesquite trees. Daniel rode steady, the baby bundled safely in his arms, while Mary Ellen clung behind him, her cheek resting against the back of his coat. She could feel the rhythm of his heartbeat through the fabric. Slow, even, sure. It was the first steady thing she'd felt in a long time. When they reached the ranch, dawn was just breaking over the hills. The sky burned gold and crimson, washing the land in color. The house stood small but sturdy, built from timber and stone. A windmill creaked nearby, its blades catching the early light. He helped her down, then led her inside. The room smelled of pine and old coffee. Everything was simple: wooden table, single bed, shelves lined with jars and tools. But it was clean. Safe. You can rest here, Daniel said, setting the baby in a small wooden cradle he'd once built for a neighbor's child. Ain't much, but it's yours till you figure what comes next. Mary Ellen stood in the doorway, unsure whether to thank him or cry. Why are you doing this? She asked. He met her eyes, steady as ever. Because I know what it's like to lose everything, he said. And to wish someone had stopped long enough to help. She didn't ask what he'd lost. She could see it in the way he looked at the world, with the quiet of a man who'd buried more than words. Instead, she nodded, whispering, "Thank you." He tipped his hat slightly and stepped outside, leaving her to the warmth of the morning light. In the days that followed, life at Hayes Ranch settled into a fragile rhythm. Daniel tended the horses and fixed fences, while Mary Ellen helped where she could, cooking simple meals, sweeping the porch, tending to the baby. They spoke little, but their silences began to mean something different, not loneliness but peace. He never asked about the man who left her, and she never pried about the past he carried. There was comfort in that unspoken understanding. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her from across the corral, his gaze thoughtful, almost protective. Once she found a fresh jug of milk on the table before dawn, a small gesture that told her more than words ever could. The baby, whom she named Clara, began to smile more often, reaching out tiny hands toward Daniel whenever he passed by. He'd always pause, letting her grasp his finger, his expression softening just enough to show the heart beneath all that silence. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, painting the sky with shades of fire, Mary Ellen stood on the porch rocking Clara to sleep. Daniel came up the path, dust clinging to his coat, his movements slow after a long day's work. She looked up at him, and for a moment their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them, a quiet recognition that they were no longer two lost souls, but something closer to a family, however fragile. But peace in Dry Creek never lasted long. Word of her staying at the ranch had reached town, and gossip once again began to move like wildfire. It burned through the saloon, the mercantile, even the church pews. Some said she trapped Daniel. Others whispered worse. One man spat near Daniel's boots when he rode into town for supplies. "Talking in another man's woman and bastard child?" The man sneered. "Ain't no good come from that." Daniel didn't respond. He just fixed the man with a cold, steady look until the sneer faded. Then he walked away. But he knew trouble was coming. In a town like Dry Creek, a woman's reputation was worth less than dust, and a man who defended her risked losing his own place among them. That night, he returned to the ranch quieter than usual. Mary Ellen noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way he lingered by the window, staring out into the dark. "They're talking again, aren't they?" she asked softly. He didn't answer, but his silence was enough. She sighed, setting the baby down gently in the cradle. "You don't have to protect me, Daniel. I've lived with their words my whole life." He turned to face her. "Maybe. But you shouldn't have to." The words hit deeper than she expected. For the first time in years, someone had said she shouldn't have to. Not that she must endure it or survive it, but that she deserved better. And that simple truth lit something inside her, a fragile flame of dignity she thought she'd lost. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. The storm Daniel had once warned about was finally coming, and not just from the sky. Everett leaned forward in his saddle, his tone sharp. "About my cousin's name. You've been dragging it through the mud long enough." "I've done no such thing," she said, though her voice trembled. "Folks in town think different," Everett shot back. "You're living here with this rancher, making a mockery of the good people who tried to help you. Ain't decent." The sheriff raised a hand as if to calm him, but his eyes betrayed a trace of agreement. "Mary Ellen," he said, "people talking don't help no one. Maybe it's best you move along before things get ugly." She opened her mouth to speak, but the sound of hooves thundered behind them. Daniel rode up fast, his jaw set hard as stone. He reined his horse between her and the men, his presence cutting through the tension like a blade. "You're trespassing," he said quietly. Everett sneered. "We're just speaking the truth, Hayes. Ain't no place for." Daniel's eyes locked on him, cold and steady. "You said what you came to say. Now leave." For a moment no one moved. The wind carried only the creak of saddles and the hiss of dust. Then the sheriff nodded reluctantly. "Come on, Everett," he said. "Ain't worth it." Everett spat in the dirt. "This ain't over," he muttered. "Town won't forget this, Hayes." Daniel didn't reply. He just waited until they were specks on the horizon before dismounting. Mary Ellen watched him, heart pounding. "They'll turn on you now," she whispered. "All because of me." He wiped the dust from his hands and looked at her. "Let 'em," he said simply. "Town turned on me long before you ever came." Her breath caught. "Why?" He hesitated, then turned toward the corral, voice quiet. "My wife and boy. Fever took him 5 winters ago. Town blamed me, said I didn't call the doctor soon enough. Maybe they were right. Maybe not. Either way, I stopped expecting kindness from folks." Mary Ellen's throat tightened. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry." He nodded once. "Don't be. Just means I know what it's like to bury love, and still keep living that." That night, neither of them spoke much, but something between them shifted, like two broken pieces finally finding where they fit. Weeks turned into months. The gossip faded to murmurs, the seasons changed, and the ranch began to breathe again. The grass grew tall, the river filled with spring water, and laughter, soft, hesitant laughter, returned to the house. Clara took her first steps across the porch, and Daniel was there, steadying her with calloused hands. Mary Ellen caught the moment in her heart like sunlight through glass. But peace, fragile as it was once again tested when Everett Pike returned, this time with 2 men and a bottle of whiskey in his hand. It was late, the sun dipping low when Daniel heard the dogs bark. He stepped out with his rifle just as the men rode up, their horses snorting and restless. "Evenin', Hayes?" Everett slurred. "Heard you and the lady been playin' house. Thought we'd come pay respects." Daniel's voice stayed calm. "You said your piece before. Ain't nothing left to talk about." But Everett wasn't there to talk. He swung down from his horse, swaggering forward. "You think you're better than the rest of us? Hiding her out here like some Saint Savon, a sinner?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're drunk. Go home." Everett laughed, a harsh, mean sound. "Maybe I'll just take her back to town myself. She's got debts to settle." The next moment happened faster than breath. Daniel stepped forward, his voice sharp as thunder. "That's enough." Everett reached for his gun. Daniel's rifle was already raised. The shot cracked through the dusk, echoing across the hills. Everett stumbled back, clutching his arm, blood seeping through his sleeve. His men froze, eyes wide. "Take him," Daniel said, his voice low but steady. "Before I stop, amen to miss." They hauled Everett onto his horse and rode off into the dark, cursing his name. Mary Ellen stood at the door, the baby in her arms, her face pale. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he said, lowering the rifle. "A man's got a right to defend what's his." Her heart stilled at the words. "What's yours?" she repeated softly. He hesitated, then met her gaze. This place. Everything I got left worth protectin'." Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't born of fear. They were born of something deeper, steadier. She took a step toward him, closing the space between them. "Then you're ours too, Daniel?" He looked at her for a long moment before finally nodding. "Reckon I am." From that night on, Dry Creek stopped whispering. They still talked, of course they always would, but the words lost their bite. No one challenged Daniel Hayes again, and no one dared speak Mary Ellen's name without respect. Years later, folks would tell the story of the silent rancher who walked into a church and found a broken woman with a newborn child. They'd say he took them in out of pity. Others swore it was love at first sight. But those who knew him best said it was something quieter, something truer. He didn't rescue her. She didn't save him. They simply found one another in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. And in the heart of a lonely Texas valley, beneath a sky wide enough to hold all their hurt and all their hope, they built a life. Not perfect, not easy, but honest. And that was enough. The summer that followed was the kind of season folks remembered for years. The one where the rain came steady, the grass grew tall, and the earth smelled of life again. The Hayes Ranch, once silent and forgotten, now carried the laughter of a child, the hum of chores done side by side, and the low call of cattle at dawn. Mary Ellen woke early each morning, the first light spilling through the window, her daughter's small voice calling out from the cradle. She'd step outside, the porch boards cool under her bare feet, and watch Daniel in the pasture, the horses moving like shadows behind him. He didn't speak much, but every action, the way he checked the fences twice, the way he built a small swing from an old oak branch for Clara, spoke louder than words ever could. Some nights, after supper, they'd sit outside beneath the stars. Clara would fall asleep on Mary Ellen's lap, her tiny breaths soft against the night. Daniel would lean back in his chair, pipe in hand, watching the horizon. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was peace. Yet even peace can ache. Mary Ellen sometimes caught herself staring at the ring she'd once worn, tucked now in a small tin box beside her bed. It wasn't the ring itself that haunted her, but what it had promised, a life that never was. She'd been left standing in front of God and everyone, holding a newborn, shamed for something she never did wrong. And though she was stronger now, those scars ran deep. One evening, as the crickets sang, Daniel noticed her quietness. "You've been far away tonight," he said gently. She hesitated, then sighed. "I keep thinking about how it all started. That church, that day. I still see their faces, the way they looked at me." Daniel turned his gaze toward her, his voice low and even. "You don't owe them your thoughts anymore." "I know," she said, her tone almost a whisper. "But it's hard to forget. They took everything from me with their stares, their words." He nodded slowly. "You can't stop folks from talking. But you can stop letting them decide who you are." She met his eyes, and for the first time she truly believed him. Still, the world outside the ranch didn't change overnight. When Daniel rode into Dry Creek for supplies, the whispers followed him. Some said he was a fool, others a sinner. But there were a few, quiet folks who saw how the man carried himself, how he treated that woman and her child with honor, who began to see the truth. Mrs. Whitlow, who ran the mercantile, was one of them. One morning, when Mary Ellen came into town for the first time in months, holding Clara by the hand, Mrs. Whitlow didn't look away like the others. She smiled. "Well, I'll be," she said. "That little one's growing fast. Got your eyes, Miss Mary Ellen?" Mary Ellen blinked, surprised. "Thank you, ma'am." The older woman leaned forward. "Don't you let this town shame you none. World's full of folks who don't know kindness till they see someone else show it." Mary Ellen left the store that day with her chin a little higher and her heart lighter. When she returned to the ranch, Daniel was mending a gate. "Town give you trouble?" he asked without looking up. "Not as much as I expected," she said. "Maybe things are changing." He gave a small nod, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe they're just learning what real folks look like." Months passed into years. Clara grew strong, her laughter filling every corner of the ranch. She called Daniel Pa long before anyone asked her to. He never corrected her. He only smiled and lifted her onto his shoulders to see the world from higher ground. Mary Ellen watched them from the porch one afternoon, the sun painting everything gold. Her heart swelled with something she couldn't name. Gratitude maybe. Or love, quiet, sure, and deep as the roots of the old oak tree by the corral. That night, after Clara was asleep, Daniel sat by the fire sharpening a blade. The rhythm of stone against metal filled the room. Mary Ellen folded the last of the laundry, her mind restless. "Daniel," she said finally, breaking the silence, "do you ever think about what comes next?" He looked up. "You mean after the chores?" She smiled faintly. "After all of this, after the whispers fade and time moves on, do you ever think about us?" He set the knife aside, his expression unreadable. "Every day." Her breath caught. "And?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. "I ain't good with fancy words, Mary Ellen. Never was. But this ranch feels more like home since you came. Feels alive again. I reckon I'd like to keep it that way, if you'd want that too. She met his eyes, and in that moment, every hurt, every loss, every lonely night she'd endured seemed to melt away. I do, she whispered. I want that more than anything. He reached for her hand, calloused and warm. Then it settled. Their wedding wasn't like the first. No church bells, no crowd, no white dress. Just the two of them beneath the wide Texas sky, with Clara sitting between them, holding a handful of wildflowers. The preacher from the next county came out and read a few words over the wind, his voice barely louder than the hum of the fields. When Daniel slipped a simple silver band onto her finger, Mary Ellen didn't weep this time. She smiled steady, proud, whole. Afterward, they shared coffee and bread at the kitchen table, laughing softly while Clara babbled to her doll. It wasn't grand, but it was real. Years later, when Clara was old enough to ask where she came from, Mary Ellen told her the truth. Not the gossip, not the shameful lies, but the real story. You were born on a day that broke my heart, she said, and saved it too. Because every step I took after that led me here, to your father, to this life. Clara listened, her eyes wide, then crawled into her mother's arms. That means I'm lucky, she said simply. Mary Ellen kissed her forehead. We all are, sweetheart. Time softened the edges of the past. Dry Creek grew quiet. Some who had once whispered began to nod politely when Daniel rode by. Others even waved. Folks started saying that maybe the silent rancher had done right after all. Maybe that woman and her child weren't a burden but a blessing. When Daniel's old horse died one spring, the whole town came to help dig the grave and raise a new barn wall. It was the first time in years that laughter echoed across the valley from so many voices. Mary Ellen watched from the porch, her heart full. The man who once lived in silence had built something no gossip could tear down. A family, a home, and a name that carried respect. One evening many years later, when Clara had children of her own, she stood beside her mother at that same porch. The field stretched golden before them, and the wind whispered through the grass. Mama, she said, people still tell your story in town? The one about how Pa found you. Mary Ellen smiled, her hands resting on the rail. Do they now? Clara nodded. They say it's a love story. Her mother's eyes softened as she looked toward the horizon, where the sun dipped behind the hills. It's a story about kindness, she said, and about a man who saw worth in what the world tried to throw away. That night, as the stars blinked awake, Mary Ellen sat alone for a while, the silver ring catching the light of the fire. She thought about that church long ago, the empty aisle, the whispers, the shame. And she thought about the man who'd walked through those same doors, quiet as a prayer, and offered not pity but a place to start again. She smiled to herself, the air cool against her skin. Thank you, she whispered, though he wasn't there to hear it, for finding us. The wind rustled the grass outside, carrying her words across the valley like a hymn. And somewhere beyond the hills, the silence that once haunted her life became something holy, a peace she had earned and a love that had outlived every storm. Years passed like the slow turning of the seasons. The ranch flourished under Daniel and Mary Ellen's quiet care. Fields that once lay dry now shimmered green in the springtime sun, and the fences stood strong, built with the kind of patience that comes only from love and labor. Clara grew tall and bright, her laughter ringing across the valley like birdsong. She was her mother's light and her father's pride. Daniel never said much about it. He rarely spoke more than needed, but every evening he'd lift his gaze from his work when Clara came running down the hill, her braid flying behind her. His lips would tug upward, just a hint of a smile, the kind that carried a lifetime's worth of meaning. The people of Dry Creek changed too. Time had a way of softening even the hardest of hearts. Men who once spat at the mention of Mary Ellen's name now tipped their hats when she passed. Women who once whispered behind her back sent fresh pies on Sundays or invited her to quilting circles. She accepted some, declined others, but never out of pride, just out of peace. The life she had built with Daniel was full enough. But life in the West was never without hardship. One summer the drought returned. The river thinned to a trickle, the grass turned brittle under the sun, and cattle began to fall thin. The wells ran low, and every morning Daniel checked the pump with a quiet frown. We'll make it through, he told her, though his voice held the strain of worry. Mary Ellen believed him, she always had. She'd seen him face storms and men far worse than nature's wrath. Yet, as the days dragged on and the land grew thirstier, she couldn't shake the unease creeping through her bones. One night, she woke to the sound of the wind pushing through the shutters. Daniel wasn't beside her. She found him outside by the corral, lantern in hand, staring toward the hills. You should be sleeping, she said softly. He didn't turn. Water lines shifting, he murmured. Creek dried faster than it should have. Might be a blockage up past the ridge. You'll go in the morning? He nodded. Before sunrise. She hesitated. You won't go alone. He gave her that half-smile she knew so well. I'll be fine, Mary. But she didn't sleep the rest of that night. When dawn broke, Daniel saddled his horse and rode out, a canteen slung over his shoulder. Mary Ellen stood on the porch, Clara beside her, waving until he disappeared beyond the ridge. Hours stretched into the longest day of her life. The sun rose high, then began to fall again, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, but Daniel didn't return. By nightfall she saddled the mule herself. Clara begged to go, but Mary Ellen only kissed her forehead. Stay by the fire, sweetheart. Mom'll bring him home. The ride through the dark was long and cruel. The wind scraped her face, dust clawed at her throat. The moon hung low, pale and thin, barely lighting the path. When she reached the ridge, she called his name, her voice breaking against the rocks. No answer came. Then, faintly, she saw the glimmer of a lantern ahead. She urged the mule forward, her heart pounding. Daniel lay near the dry creek bed, his leg pinned under a fallen log. The horse grazed nearby, the ground cracked and dry beneath them. Daniel, she cried, rushing to his side. He looked up, relief flickering in his tired eyes. You shouldn't come alone. She was already pulling at the log, her hands raw and shaking. Don't you dare tell me that now. Together they managed to free him, though pain shot through his leg when he tried to stand. It's not broke, he said through gritted teeth. Just bad twisted. She tore a strip from her skirt, wrapping his leg tight. We'll rest a minute, then go back. He nodded, watching her in the flickering lantern light. You always did have more fight than sense, he said softly. She smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. Someone in this family has to. They made it back to the ranch by dawn. Clara ran out crying when she saw them, throwing her arms around his neck. He winced but hugged her tight, whispering, Told you I'd be fine. For the next few weeks, Daniel stayed off his leg while Mary Ellen took on the work of two people. She rose before sunrise, drove the cattle to water, fixed the fences, and still found time to sing Clara to sleep each night. Daniel tried to protest, but she'd hush him with a look. You've carried this place long enough, she'd say. It's my turn. He'd smile quietly, pride and love filling his eyes. I reckon I married the strongest woman in Texas. She laughed softly. And the most stubborn, don't forget. By the time autumn rolled in, the rains finally came. The land drank deep and the ranch came alive again. The fields bloomed green, the cattle fattened, and for the first time in months, laughter returned to their table. One crisp evening they rode out together, Mary Ellen, Daniel and Clara, watching the sky burn orange above the horizon. Looks like the valley's breathing again, Daniel said. Mary Ellen nodded, her hand brushing his. So are we. But even in peace, life finds a way to test what's been built. The following winter brought a sickness that swept through the valley. Coughs turned deep, fevers burned high. The doctor from the next town did what he could, but he couldn't reach everyone in time. One morning, Daniel didn't come down for breakfast. Mary Ellen found him still in bed, his forehead burning hot. Her heart froze. No, she whispered, sitting beside him. Not you. Not now. He tried to smile through the fever. It's just a chill. But by nightfall it wasn't just a chill. The fever came hard and fast, stealing his breath, dimming his strength. Mary Ellen refused to leave his side. She mixed herbs, cooled his forehead with damp cloths, prayed under her breath until her voice was raw. Days blurred together. Clara sat by the doorway, clutching her doll, watching her mother fight for the man who'd once saved them both. On the third night, the wind outside howled against the windows and Daniel stirred weakly. Mary, he murmured, his voice thin. I'm here, she whispered, holding his hand. He looked at her with eyes half closed, a faint smile ghosting his lips. You remember that church? The day I found you? She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I remember. Thought I was just bringing you to safety, he said. Didn't know you'd be the one save on me. Don't you dare say goodbye, she said, voice trembling. You're not leaving us. He reached up, his hand brushing her cheek. If I go, he whispered, you keep living? You hear me? Keep the ranch, raise Clara strong. She's got your fire, Daniel. But he fell silent. His eyes closed, his hand slipping from hers. Mary Ellen froze, the room spinning. Then she felt it, the faintest breath against her palm. He was still there, clinging to life by a thread. She held him through the night, praying for morning. When dawn came, light spilled through the window, soft and golden. His eyes fluttered open. Weak but alive. Mary Ellen let out a shaky breath, her tears falling onto his hand. "You scared me half to death," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Reckon I'm too stubborn to leave you behind." She laughed through her tears, pressing her forehead against his. "Then you stay right here, Daniel Hayes. You hear me? You stay." And he did. Weeks later, when the fever passed and strength returned to his hands, he walked out onto the porch with her. They stood together watching the horizon the same way they had for years. The land stretched wide and wild before them, golden in the morning light. "You ever think about how far we've come?" she asked softly. He nodded, slipping his arm around her shoulders. "Every day." They stood there in silence, the sound of Clara's laughter drifting from the yard, the wind carrying the scent of earth and rain. Mary Ellen leaned against him, her heart steady. Once she'd been left at an altar, broken and forgotten. But here, with this man in this land, she'd found everything she'd ever prayed for: dignity, love, and peace that no gossip could take away. And as the sun rose over Dry Creek, she knew that even in a world that could be cruel, kindness still had the power to rewrite a life. Years later, the people of Dry Creek often said that Mary Ellen Hayes was the kind of woman the land itself respected. The earth gave to her what it wouldn't give to most: a good harvest, gentle rains, peace in her home. Maybe it was because she'd never asked for more than her share. Maybe it was because she'd earned it. Clara was nearly grown now, her hair the color of honey in the sun, her spirit much like her mother's, soft where it counted, fierce when it mattered. She helped her father mend fences, her mother tend to the garden, and though she laughed like a child, her eyes carried wisdom far beyond her years. One summer evening she rode into town alone for the first time. Daniel had trusted her with the wagon and 2 sacks of grain to trade for supplies. Dry Creek had changed in those years. New faces, new buildings, but some memories still lingered, especially for those who'd been there the day a young bride had been left standing at the altar. As Clara tied her horse outside the general store, a group of men on the porch fell quiet. One of them, older now, with a face rough as bark, squinted. "Ain't that Mary Ellen's girl?" Another spat into the dirt. "Looks just like her, don't she?" "Same eyes." Clara felt their stares but said nothing. She'd learned from her father's silence how to let words fall useless to the ground. She walked past them, her chin high. Inside, Mr. Finch, the storekeeper, greeted her warmly. "Well, if it ain't Miss Clara Hayes. Your ma taught you manners well. Look at you all grown up." She smiled, polite as ever. "Thank you, Mr. Finch. I just need flour, sugar, and some salt pork if you have it." Of course," he said, bustling to fill her order. Then, lowering his voice, "How's your pa doin'? Heard he had a bad spell last winter." "He's better now," Clara said with pride. "Stronger than ever." When she left, the same men were still on the porch. One of them muttered, "Guess the rancher raised her right even if he did marry trouble." This time Clara stopped. She turned, her gaze steady. "My father married a woman stronger than any man I've ever met. And she's not trouble, she's the reason half of you have food when the drought comes." The man blinked, caught off guard. The others shifted uneasily. She didn't wait for a reply. She climbed into the wagon, flicked the reins, and rode away. That night, when she told her parents what had happened, Daniel looked at her quietly for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "You did right." Mary Ellen reached across the table, touching her daughter's hand. "Never let them make you small, Clara. Not for what you were born into, not for who you are." Clara squeezed her hand back. "I won't, Mama." The world kept changing after that. Railroads came closer, bringing strangers and noise. The quiet that once wrapped the valley began to fade, replaced by the rumble of wagons, the clang of steel, the promise of new times. Daniel watched it all with a wary eye. "Progress," he said one evening, leaning on the fence. "That's what they call it." Mary Ellen stood beside him. "Do you think it's good?" He shrugged. "It don't care what we think. It's coming either way." He was right. The next year, a group of men from a new mining company came through Dry Creek, offering money for land rights. They claimed there was silver deep beneath the hills, enough to make every rancher rich. Some sold quick, greedy for the promise. Others, like Daniel, refused. "This land ain't for sale," he told the company man who came knocking. "It's not just dirt. It's home." The man smiled thinly. "You'll change your mind when the wells run dry again." Daniel's eyes hardened. "I've seen the land dry up and come back. Can't say the same for men's hearts." The company left, but not quietly. Rumors spread, false ones, cruel ones, claiming Daniel was hiding debts, that Mary Ellen's past made the ranch unfit for business. For a while the old gossip came back like poison in the air. But something was different now. The people of Dry Creek weren't the same either. Some of those who'd once turned away now stood beside the Hayes. One day, old Mrs. Barlow from the church brought over a pie and said, "I remember what they said about you years ago, Mary Ellen. I listened then when I shouldn't have. I'm sorry for that." Mary Ellen smiled, her voice gentle. "That was a long time ago, Mrs. Barlow." The woman shook her head. "Maybe so. But some things need saying, while we still got breath." It was a small thing, but it meant more than anyone could guess. As the years passed, Daniel's hair turned silver, his back stooped a little, but his eyes stayed sharp. Mary Ellen's hands grew lined, her hair streaked with gray, but her spirit never dimmed. They lived to see Clara marry a good man from a neighboring ranch. He wasn't rich or loud, just kind the way her father was. When the wedding day came, the whole town gathered. And this time there was no silence, no shame, no turning away. The church bells rang bright, echoing down the valley, and as Daniel walked his daughter down the aisle, Mary Ellen's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother to hide. When Clara turned back to look at them before saying her vows, Mary Ellen saw not just her daughter, but every woman who'd ever been left behind, judged or doubted, and still stood tall. After the ceremony, as twilight painted the sky, Daniel and Mary Ellen sat on the porch, listening to laughter spill from the barn where the wedding feast carried on. "Remember that first day?" Daniel said quietly. "You in that church holding a baby looking at me like I was out of my mind." Mary Ellen laughed softly. "I thought you were." He smiled. "Reckon I was. Best foolish thing I ever did." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And I reckon I was lucky you walked through that door." The stars began to rise one by one. Somewhere in the distance, Clara's voice carried through the air, bright and full of life. Mary Ellen closed her eyes, letting the sound fill her heart. The world had tried to break her once, but it had failed. She had found her own kind of justice, her own kind of dignity, not through vengeance or wealth, but through love that endured every storm. And as the wind moved softly through the tall grass, Daniel took her hand, their fingers weaving together like they always had. Neither of them spoke another word, but they didn't need to. For in that quiet, beneath the endless western sky, they knew they had won, not in the eyes of the town but in the eyes of time. The years that followed were kind and quiet, the sort of peace that only comes after a lifetime of storms. The ranch stood strong under the same wide sky that had once watched Mary Ellen's tears and Daniel's steadfast silence. Now, it watched over them with gentleness, as if the land itself remembered what they had endured. Clara and her husband took over much of the work as Daniel's hands grew slower. He still woke before dawn, still walked the fence line, still checked the horses as though they might forget he loved them if he didn't. But there was a softness in his steps now, a man who had fought all his battles and made peace with the years. Mary Ellen spent her mornings in the garden, where roses bloomed along the fence. Folks would stop by just to see them, saying she had a way of coaxing life from even the driest soil. She'd smile and say, "You just have to give things a reason to grow." One evening, Clara came home with her newborn son in her arms. The house that had once echoed with silence now filled with tiny cries and laughter. Daniel took the baby in his arms, his weathered hands trembling. "Well now," he murmured, "looks like another Hayes to work the land someday." Mary Ellen watched him, her heart swelling with the same awe she had felt all those years ago when he'd first held her own child. Life had come full circle, and it was beautiful in its simplicity. But time, even when kind, never stops. One spring morning, Daniel didn't come in for breakfast. Mary Ellen found him by the barn, sitting on the old bench he'd built decades ago. His hat lay in his lap, his face turned toward the sunrise. For a moment she thought he was just resting. But when she touched his shoulder, the stillness told her otherwise. She sank beside him, her hand over his, her breath catching in the soft morning air. There were no tears at first, just quiet. A quiet so deep it seemed the whole valley bowed its head. When Clara came running, Mary Ellen looked up, her voice barely a whisper. "He's gone home, sweetheart." The funeral drew people from miles around. Men who'd once spoken against him came to stand in silence, hats in hand. Women brought flowers, filling the church with color and scent. The preacher spoke kindly, but it was Mary Ellen who said the truest words when she stood beside the grave. "Daniel Hayes never said much," she began, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "But when he did, it mattered. He saved me when I had no reason to believe anyone would. He gave me a name, a home, and a life I never thought I'd deserve. And though he's gone, everything good in this valley carries his touch." Her words hung in the air long after she stopped speaking. After the crowd left, she stayed by the grave until the sun dipped low. The sky burned gold and purple the same way it had on the day they first met. She laid her hand on the cool earth. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You never left me." That night the house felt too big, too quiet. But when she stepped onto the porch, she felt the wind move through the grass and the sound of the horses in the distance. It felt like him. The days passed, then weeks, then months. Mary Ellen carried on because that's what he would have wanted. Clara visited often, her little boy growing wild and strong, chasing chickens and laughing at the top of his lungs. Every time he ran across the yard, Mary Ellen could almost see Daniel's shadow walking beside him. One autumn evening she sat on that same porch, a shawl around her shoulders, watching the last light fade from the hills. Clara came out, the boy asleep in her arms. "Mama," she said softly, "you should rest." Mary Ellen smiled faintly. "I'm just watching the world go quiet. It's a fine thing to do." Clara sat beside her. "You miss him every day, don't you?" Mary Ellen nodded. "Every breath. But I don't feel alone. Not out here." She looked toward the fields, the fences, the river glinting far away. "He's everywhere, Clara. In the soil, in the wind, in that child's laughter. Love like that doesn't die, it just takes a different shape." They sat together until the stars came out, the sky deep and endless above them. Years later, when Mary Ellen's hands grew too weak to hold the reins, and her eyes too dim to see the far ridge, Clara found her one morning sitting on the porch, her shawl neatly folded, her gaze turned toward the sunrise, just as Daniel's had been. She looked peaceful, her lips curved in the faintest smile. The kind of smile that belonged to someone who had finally come home. The townsfolk said she went the way she lived, with quiet grace. They buried her beside Daniel, under the oak tree by the ridge. On her stone, Clara had carved the words her mother used to whisper on long nights when storms rattled the windows. "Love endures even when words fade." Years passed and the ranch stayed in the family. New hands worked the fields, new laughter echoed through the halls. And though the world beyond Dry Creek grew louder, faster, and more modern with every decade, those who passed through the valley could still feel something different in the air. A kind of peace, a kind of strength that couldn't be bought or taught. Sometimes when the sun set over the hills just right, folks swore they could see two figures standing by the oak tree. A man and a woman side by side watching the land they built with their hearts. And maybe it was just the light or maybe it was something more. Because some love stories, the ones born from pain and carried by faith, never truly end. They just keep on living, in the wind that moves the grass, in the laughter of children, and in the memory of a woman who was once left at the altar with a newborn baby girl, until a silent rancher walked in and changed everything. Long after Mary Ellen and Daniel were gone, the Hayes Ranch remained a landmark in Dry Creek. Folks said it was more than land, it was a legacy, a story carved into the soil. Clara's son Thomas grew to be a man much like his grandfather. Steady, quiet, with a heart full of respect for the earth beneath his boots. He married young to a woman named Lila who came from the city, and though she wasn't used to the dust and long days, she learned to love it because he did. Thomas often sat on the porch in the evenings, his boy beside him, telling the stories his mother had told him. About Mary Ellen's courage, about Daniel's silence, and how love had built this home when the world tried to tear it apart. He never exaggerated or turned it into legend. He told it plain like truth should be told. "Your great-grandma," he'd say, "wasn't born strong. She became strong because she had to. And your great-grandpa? He wasn't talkative, but he said more with his actions than most men could with words." The boy would listen wide-eyed as the wind whispered through the grass. "Were they happy?" he'd always ask. Thomas would smile faintly. "More than most. Because they didn't measure happiness by what they had, but by who they loved." The years rolled on. Dry Creek changed again. The train stopped running through town and some folks moved away chasing work in the cities. But the Hayes Ranch stood firm. Its fences weathered, its barns leaned a little more each year, but its spirit never wavered. One spring Thomas found a bundle of old letters while cleaning out the attic. They were yellowed and tied with faded ribbon. The handwriting was neat, careful. Mary Ellen's. They weren't love letters, not in the usual sense. They were notes she'd written to Daniel over the years, tucked away, maybe never even shown to him. He sat by the window reading them one by one. "Some days I still feel like the girl who stood in that church waiting for someone who never came. But then you walk through the door and I remember that love doesn't always arrive in the way we expect. It arrives in the way we need." And another. "I watch you work, quiet as the dawn, and I think that maybe God gives certain souls a peace too deep for words. You don't speak much, but I hear you every time you look at me. Thomas folded the letters carefully and placed them in a small wooden box. That night, he brought it to his mother, Clara, who sat rocking by the fire, her hair white as the snow outside. She opened the box, her eyes soft with memory. She used to write those when Pa was out working the far pastures, she said. She'd tell me, when a woman loves a man like that, she has to find her own way to speak to him. Thomas hesitated. Do you think they knew how much their story would mean to people? Clara smiled faintly. They didn't do it for people, son. They just lived it. And that's what makes it worth telling. That night Thomas went outside. The moon hung low, spilling light across the fields. He walked to the old oak tree where Mary Ellen and Daniel were buried. The wind moved gently through the branches, the grass whispering around him. He set the box down between the two stones. Your story still lives, he said quietly. And I reckon it always will. In the years that followed, more generations were born under that same roof. The world around them grew electric, machines, lights, noise, but the ranch stayed mostly the same. People came from neighboring towns, curious to see the place they'd heard about in quiet stories passed down through families. Some called it superstition. Others said it was just history. But those who stood beneath that old oak, listening to the wind move through the valley, swore they felt something deeper, like a presence or maybe a blessing. One writer from the city came once, asking to see the place. He sat with Thomas's grandson, now the keeper of the ranch, and asked, "Do you believe they're still here?" The man chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. Believe? No. I don't need to. I feel it. He pointed toward the horizon where the sun was setting, painting the sky gold and crimson. See that? That's how it always looked when Daniel used to ride home from the fields. Grandma Mary Ellen said the sky always turned to fire when he was near. That's not belief, that's memory. The writer smiled, jotting something in his notebook. And what do you think their story means? The old man thought for a moment before answering. I think it means you don't have to be loud to change the world. You just have to love right, stand firm, and keep your word. The rest takes care of itself. When the writer left, the ranch returned to its quiet rhythm. The creak of the windmill, the distant call of a hawk, the steady heartbeat of the land. At sunset, the man's granddaughter, just a little girl, ran barefoot through the tall grass, her laughter echoing across the valley. From the porch, he watched her, a smile tugging at his lips. He could almost hear his grandmother's voice in the wind, soft and sure, "Love endures even when words fade." And as the stars began to blink awake over Dry Creek, that truth lingered, woven into the earth, into the air, into every heart that had ever called that ranch home. For the story of the woman left at the altar and the silent rancher who took her in was no longer just a tale from the past. It had become something living, breathing, passed down from hand to hand, voice to voice. And as long as there was wind to move the grass, or hearts brave enough to love through hardship, their story would never end.